I first want to thank the committee for asking me to come up here, and I really appreciated the hospitality. It's been very, very nice. I've enjoyed myself. I look at this as a welcome retreat in life's busy schedule. I'm right now, and I have been for the last few years in school and working and everything else, and I don't get the opportunity to do this. Even just go to meetings and things of that nature, much less go to a convention, and much less get to share at a convention. So I appreciate this. I think I might use the opportunity now to take a plug at the old sponsor, because it's the first time during the convention that I'm probably not within hitting distance. I got to ride up here with him yesterday morning. It's about a 4-hour drive from Baytown, and I had some things I needed to take care of in San Marcos. And I grew up there for like 13 or 14 years, and I love the place. When I think about San Marcos, I think of Central Texas and the hill country, much like Bastrop. And to me, it's just one of the greatest places in the world. I just love the rivers and everything else and have a lot of good memories. And so I was telling him all about it, and I was wanting him to really like it. And the first thing we do when we get there, he says, "The armpit of America." And I was resentful because he didn't like it. And I said, "Well, let's get some breakfast." And he says, "There's not a kettle, there's not a Denny's, there's nothing around. I'm starving, I'm tired, and you just dragging me through this town." And he's grumpy and everything else, and that's par. But we finally find this restaurant and get settled down. He says, "The hash browns are mushy, the eggs are mushy. Boy, this place is just worthless." And I'm just getting more and more irritated. And I said, "We just need to get out of this town because this just is not very good." And I started driving, and as I got out of town, it dawned on me what was happening. Is number one, it's understandable he was tired and hadn't eaten, and so he's just being grumpy. I understand, I get that way too. But he did not have, and my mom pointed this out to me, he did not have the memories that I associated with that town. And the reason I bring the stories up is not really I'm just harassing him. The reason is to tell you that my childhood and my early days were not bad. I have very many pleasant memories of times with family and friends. I cannot look back and say that things were terrible for me. There's no doubt that there are a lot of people who have had awful childhoods. I've been in AA long enough to hear some really horrid stories, and they are obviously miracles. Those people are, because of the things they've had to walk through. But in my case, I had everything going for me, it seemed. I had a real good mother. I will say this. The first 3 years of my life, from age till I was 3, I lived in a household where my father was very violent, and he abused my mom, and he abused me, and she eventually left him. And though that certainly affected the way I think I thought about things, I'm not going to look at that and say that that's why I'm alcoholic, because I can't do that for my own peace of mind. I have to some point say I'm accountable for what I did, and so I'll get to that first 3 years eventually, but I want to say that the early years were great. Since my father was not there, I basically had a grandfather that raised me, as also my grandmother. And they were very supportive, and they loved me. And they did everything in the world for me. And I don't know that I ever really showed any appreciation for this. My mom said early on, that should have indicated to me that I probably had a problem when I was real young. She said, "You know, you're a very selfish child." And I didn't understand what she meant by that, because I thought I was giving. I thought that I only wanted the best for people. I thought I was always trying to be nice, so that made me unselfish, and that wasn't it at all. I know today the reason I was always trying to be nice and go out of the way and things like that is I was trying to manipulate the situation in many ways to try to get people to like me. Fortunately for me, when I was about 16, I found something that I think helped people like me, and that was alcohol. When I was out playing tennis one day with an older guy, we got done, and afterwards he said, "Why don't we go over here and get a few beers?" And I said, "Well, that's great." And we stopped by this 7-Eleven, and he picked up a couple of Budweisers. And the thing I remember about those drinks is when they went down me, I think I only had 2, but when they went down me, I noticed a difference. And it was unlike any other time I had had any drinks before, because I'd tasted a little of Mom's wine, I'd tasted a little bourbon before, I'd gotten into my grandmother's gin, and nothing ever really happened. This time, however, when it went down there was something distinctly different. The physical thing is that my nose was buzzing and my face was buzzing and everything. Just was a funny tingling feeling all over. And that's the first thing I said to the guy that was with me. But besides that, there was something I could not express to him, and that was how alcohol made me feel on the inside. Because when I looked at him, for the first time, I looked and I said, "You know what? He thinks I'm okay. And you know what? I think I'm okay." And that was something alcohol for me from that point on. That day, once we got home from playing tennis, I still had this beer buzz going, and my boss called me into work, and I wasn't planning on going to work that day. I wasn't supposed to, but somebody canceled out. And I went in drunk, and things were already different. I walked in and I could tell immediately when I looked into the room, all these girls over there behind the counter thought I was very, very cute. And I could tell that the guys thought I was very, very tough, somebody to be reckoned with. And it was that alcohol, and it was working for me, and it was great, and I loved it. The thing I did notice is the only perception that it changed was my own, not theirs. It was my own. But I loved that feeling. And from that point on, alcohol began to govern what I did, where I went, and who I was with when I did the drinking. I started looking for alcohol on the weekends. See, I had a hard time seeing these things when I first came into Alcoholics Anonymous, the fact that I was actually being manipulated by alcohol in a way, because I'd only drank for like 4 years. I was 20 years old when I came into AA, and I just couldn't see this stuff. And it took me a long time in Alcoholics Anonymous to be able to realize that a lot of the things that might have been happening to people who drank for 30 years were in their own way happening to me. They were happening under different circumstances. Anyway, what was I saying? Talking about the things happening to me that happened to you? Oh, yeah, that's right. Getting in trouble at work and things of that nature. Anyway, I continued to drink. And it wasn't so bad in high school. I mean, of course, I didn't do well. I didn't make good grades or anything like that. I don't know that I skipped any classes, maybe a few. But I really didn't get in trouble, except for during spring break, because there was a week when we didn't have to go to school, and I would take off with some friends, and we'd get drunk, and I got into all kinds of things. I wouldn't just get into the drinking, but I did eventually get into narcotics, and I agree with Ray in the sense that I don't consider myself an alcoholic and an addict. I consider myself an alcoholic who did drugs. A lot of people, when they drink, they lose inhibitions. Things they wouldn't have done before, as they drink, they will eventually begin to do those things. You may not agree with stealing initially. Drink long enough, you might agree with anything to get money for booze. Well, for me, I didn't agree with doing drugs, so I drank. It was all right to drink and hurt people. It wasn't okay to do drugs and hurt people. But eventually, I think I wore away any inhibition against doing something that made me feel different. So I eventually turned to drugs. And so we'd go out on spring break, and we'd smoke pot, and we'd drink, and we'd inhale Freon. There's all kinds of things they do these days. And I had a lot of fun, especially with that feeling, because that was what I was always looking for. But alcohol really didn't begin to wear on me until I got out of high school, and this was when I really began to get in a lot of trouble. The first thing I did when I got out of high school, besides getting drunk, was nothing. I just drank and drank and drank. A lot of my friends decided they were going to go to college. A lot of my friends decided they were going to go into the military. Some of them got their jobs, and some of them got families and began to settle down. And I wasn't interested in any of those things. I was interested just in drinking. I was interested in having fun. One thing I did notice, however, is that every time I would get into a little trouble with drinking, my health would start declining. I would try to straighten up. I would say, okay, well, let me just get a job for a little bit and get back out there and get my health together. And I would leave the alcohol alone for a little while, about a month or so, and some friends would come by and let's say, hey, let's go get a drink. I said, well, no problem. I'll just have a few drinks. And the next day, I wouldn't be working, and I would be drinking, and I'd go another 3 or 4 months, and my health would decline, and I would normally get introduced to some more narcotics because I was always getting into that stuff as well. And my health would get real bad. And I'd say, well, it's time. This time, let's go to school, or let's go get enlisted for the military. Let's do something like that. And I would stop for a little while. Maybe a month or 2 months would go by, and some friends would show up, and they'd say, let's go get a few drinks. And I'd say, well, great, let's go have a drink. And pretty soon I wasn't working, and I was drinking. And this was just a pattern with me, and it was not a pattern that I could see until I was in Alcoholics Anonymous for a year or so. And so I was always getting in trouble, and I couldn't seem to stay off the alcohol, even though I didn't realize that it was a problem with me. One of the things that I found out was well, I won't say that yet. One of the things I eventually did, because I got into cocaine after a while, it began to be very, very expensive trying to drink, trying to use narcotics and things of that nature. And I said, well, I really need to make some money somehow if I'm going to support these habits. And I said, well, what can I do? And I met some friends when we'd go out to nightclubs, and what they would do is they would get a couple of pills from these friends, and they would sell them and make a little money for themselves, buy pills so they could eat them. Well, I said, well, that was great. I would try that. And I did this for a little while. I really liked that. I took that because it seemed like the people in the clubs were the ones that were respected, the ones that were selling the narcotics and things of that nature. Those were the people that got all the respect. Everybody wanted to be their friends because they had the narcotics. And so I said, well, that's what I want to do. And so I got done watching this movie Scarface, if you've ever seen it before. And I said the thing to do is be a gangster and go out there and, I remember that movie vividly because it made such an impression on me. You notice that he drove like a Mercedes, and he lived in this big mansion, and he got to date Michelle Pfeiffer? Well, that's what I wanted, see? And so I said, if I just go out there and live like that, well, that'll be great. I can have all those things. I can have that respect from other people. I can have the money, and I can have the girls, and the nice clothes, and the cars. And those are the things I wanted. And I didn't know why I wanted them. Today I know that deep down there on the inside, I just felt like somehow I didn't fit in and I wasn't as good as other people. And this was something that, even though, like I said earlier, I really enjoyed growing up in San Marcos, one thing I always noticed about that is I always kind of felt like I didn't fit in. And you've heard that 100 times, 1,000 times from AA members, maybe all non-members too, that you just don't feel like you fit in. And I wanted to. And I didn't know exactly how to act and what to think and what to say to try to be like those friends of mine. In San Marcos, we grew up like on the poor side of town. My mom was, and my family, we were on welfare. And so I didn't get to have all the things I really wanted when I was growing up. But you know what determined what I wanted was not what was necessary. What determined what I wanted was what my friends had, see? And it just so happened that I hung around with all the rich kids. All my friends, their fathers were doctors and lawyers and professors up at the university, and they got to wear the nice clothes. And if they wanted to play tennis, their parents would get them tennis lessons. And when they turned 16, their parents would get them cars. And me being a little crybaby, well, I wanted these things too, you know. I want to fit in. And I didn't give any thought of how this affected my mom to make such demands. I didn't give any thought to how it affected my grandparents to make such demands. What I was concerned about was with getting what I needed to try to be okay with those people. I remember the same thing about church. I had a hard time in the beginning. My grandmother always took me to church. And I know today that the minister, I don't think really that my minister preached hellfire and damnation. I just think that's what I heard. I really don't think he preached that, but that's obviously what I heard. And they scared me into walking up the aisle. Matter of fact, I think I walked up that aisle 3 or 4 times. I've been baptized, I know, 3 times. And I've been baptized under different denominations. And I heard a guy say it real well one time. He says, well, I thought I'd better hit them all just because I don't want to be left out of heaven on a technicality. And I didn't, so I figured I might as well get them all. But whenever I would see these other people walk up there and they'd go get baptized, they'd come up out of the water and they'd be singing hallelujah, and they'd act like they were different, all right? And I went up there and I got baptized and I came out of the water and I felt the same. And I didn't understand because it seemed like what they had when they came out and what I was getting when I came out were 2 different things. And so there again, I felt like I wasn't able to fit in with that group of people. Somehow they were different from me. And this is the way I felt everywhere I went. Until I found alcohol. And back to the story anyway, back to this doing the drugs and trying to be a gangster, you know, I thought this was going to be great, so I moved to Houston. I told my parents I was really going to Houston to go to school. It wasn't the truth. I dropped out of school. I'd been in for probably 3 months, and actually 3 weeks, not 3 months, 3 weeks. And I said, that's it for me. I didn't want that kind of life because it required work, and I didn't want anything to do with work. I wanted things to be handed to me on a silver platter because I thought I deserved it. And it's kind of a weird thing with that first 3 years of my life that I told you about with my father, all right? I spent a lot of time saying that, you know, it's all his fault. You know, I've grown up in this you know, with this guy who beat me all these years, even though I really didn't have a lot of memories of it. And I grew up in poverty, and it's all their fault because I didn't get what I wanted, see? And if my parents had been rich, well, then I'd have been okay, see? And if my father would have been so violent, I'd have been okay. And I don't know what differences those would have made. But the thing was I was always concerned about what should have been and what could have been had people acted differently. And I was never concerned about what could be if I acted differently. And anyway, so I got out here and I was playing gangster in Houston, and I actually had a lot of fun. I'm not going to say that my drinking days were all terrible because they weren't. I had a whole bunch of fun, especially the first 3 or 4 months when I lived down there. The reason being because for the first time in my life, I didn't have to answer to my parents, tell them where I was going to go, who I was going to be going with, what I was going to do, when I was going to be back. They weren't going to be mad at me if I came home and smoked a joint. You know, I could do that. If I came home with beer in my breath, there was nobody there to complain. And so I really loved being out on my own. Another thing was I got to carry around a little bit of money and stuff like that, and I got to wear these nice clothes. I really loved the image that went along with doing those things. Now, in all honesty, I have to tell you that the clothes were stolen, that the money was stolen, that the drugs were stolen, that everything I had was stolen. I used to like to think that I went out there and I created this empire all by myself, and I didn't do any of that. I'd just be in the right place at the right time to steal from somebody. I basically bummed, which is what I was. But I had a lot of fun, I thought, out there for the first 4 months or so. One thing I found out, however, is that you hang around that environment long enough, you're going to run into some pretty nasty people. I used to think the thing to worry about out there was the alcohol and drugs. Today I know there's more out there than just the alcohol and drugs. There's the environment. The people I ran into eventually were there were people that were not playing a game. I was out there playing a game, really. I kind of looked at what I was doing as it was a movie. I thought I was out there just having fun. We were playing cops and robbers. After the guy gets shot, they yell cut, and he gets up and goes to the dressing room and cleans off. He's okay. And what I didn't realize out there is that when people do that stuff out there, it's very real. Well, see, I was really living in fantasy. All right? I had no idea of what reality it was. I had no idea what was really going on out there until one of the little alarm clocks went off. I found myself running for my life. I was out of town doing one of those drug dealing things, and I found myself running for my life from a guy that had put a contract out on me. And I was kind of, when I found out how much it was for, because somebody had told me later on it was like a $20 contract, I was kind of disappointed. I said, man, you know, I don't mind people wanting to kill me as long as it's worth more than that, you know. Pretty bad contract, but, you know, anyway, what could they have bought for $20? Anyway, I found myself running for my life from that contract deal, and that was the scariest night of my life. I remember hearing this somewhere, that the fear of death is worse than death itself. And that's what I experienced that night, because there was like a good 30 minutes that all I could do was anticipate what was going to happen when they caught up with me, because I was running. And as I would run, I would sit there and think. I said, oh my gosh, I wonder what it's like to die. That's a scary thought, and it's a real twisted thought. But that's exactly what's going to go through your mind when you think death is just 30 minutes behind you, or a few feet behind you. I was terrified. And as I was running, one of the things I did was I stopped and I screamed and I said, that's it, I quit. Because I was tired of running. You know, I was exhausted, but I was tired of running because I'd been running at that time. I'd been hiding out for probably 2 months, and I didn't want to run anymore. I'd been playing a game out there for a long time, and I'd been hurting people and stealing from people and things of that nature, and I was really getting sick. All right, mentally, emotionally, everything else, I was really getting sick, and I was tired of running, and I was tired of living that lifestyle of always having to be out in the, you know, stuck out somewhere away from people. And I remember one of the places I was hiding out at was out in Tomball, in just some old house way out in the middle of the country. And there wasn't any alcohol or any drugs out there, and some friends had just taken me out there and left me because they knew that this team was looking for me. And they took me out there and left me with no alcohol or drugs. That was the bad part. The reason it was bad is because for weeks I didn't have anything to drink or do, and all I could do was go around and be crazy. See? That's exactly what it was like. And not only that, but all they left me in the icebox, well, they did leave me 2 beers and a jar of jalapeno peppers. And I lived on that for like a week and went to the bathroom, God. But it was terrible being out there because there was nothing to ease the pain. It was the first time, I think, in the 8 months that I was living out all over the place in Houston, that I didn't have alcohol and drugs, and it was the first time that I could look and say, look where you're at. You know, up to that time, I'd been so busy drinking, and I'd been so busy using narcotics, and I'd been so busy running and living the lifestyle and hanging out in the nightlife and things of that nature, that I didn't stop to think, look where you're at. What do you have to show for all this? And so I don't know if I used the time wisely by thinking. I don't think so, because shortly after that, I was up in Austin getting chased down for being a fool. But it was terrible. And that night, when I was running, I thought about this. I thought about what I've been doing with my life. And I was ready to die. I think every alcoholic, at some point in their life, they get there and they want to die. It's kind of like suicide. Even though I didn't have a gun pulled, you know, at my head, and even though I didn't have a bunch of pills that I was wanting to overdose with or anything of that nature, in my own way, I think I committed suicide because at that point I was willing for those guys to catch me. It was okay. I don't know that I really wanted to die, but I preferred it to running. You know, I didn't want to run anymore. I didn't want to live that life anymore, and if they caught me, that would have been better. And so in my way, that was suicide. And my life flashed before my eyes, and I won't tell you about that part because that part is insignificant in this story. What is important is what happened after that. There's another part of my life that flashed in front of my eyes, and that was the part that could have been. What I started thinking was not about all the bad things I'd done. I didn't think about that. What I started thinking about is what could have happened if I would have just taken a different route a few years back. If I wouldn't have been drinking, see. I started thinking about maybe I could have gone out there and I could have gotten a job and, just been an average guy. I never wanted to be average. But for the first time, it's kind of appealed to me to be average. Go out there and hold a job. Make a contribution to society. Go out there and raise a family. See, go out there and give something back instead of always taking. And I just thought, that'd been awful nice. I bet that'd have been a neat life to live. And from somewhere deep down inside, I kind of felt from within me the strength to keep on running. Because I said, if that little thing is out there, if there's a hope of getting to that point in my life, I want to try. Because I want to see what that life is like. I've lived the other life. I want to see what that life is like. And I started running. And I was barefoot because I'd thrown my shoes off to help me run a little quicker. And I'd been running on pebbled ground, but luckily I was drunk enough that I didn't feel anything till the next day because my feet were just torn up. But I ran and ran and ran until I got back to a friend's house, and he got me on a bus back to Houston. And I got back down to Houston, and all of a sudden this fear of dying leaves. You know how the alcoholic is. Just takes a little while before you stop hurting, and then all of a sudden you're scheming again to how can you get a drink or a pill or something of that nature. And me, I was back in a bar sitting, probably one of the last bars I drank at. Only bar I ever drank at. I was 20 years old. I never did. As a matter of fact, it's the only time I ever went into a bar and actually bought a drink. I look young now. 6 years ago, I looked even younger. You know that I didn't go into bars and drink. But I went in there and I ordered 2 double Bloody Marys. And I sat there and drank those things, and the thought that crossed my mind was, I wonder how I can go back to Austin and show those guys who's boss, see? Because they'd offended me, see? My ego was hurt because I wasn't as tough as I'd been making myself out to be. It's amazing how my mind rationalized that, but I was just saying, I need to teach those guys something. I was really into this thing on wanting especially guys, because guys intimidated the hell out of me. They really did. And I don't know if it is as tied to my father or not, but they really intimidated me. I thought I wanted them to respect me, see? I really thought that's what I wanted. And today I know that's not the truth. What I wanted them to fear me because I was so afraid of them. And I thought if I could just make them fear me, then they maybe will stay over there. And I don't have to worry about them hurting me because I was real afraid of other people hurting me. See, I was a real small guy in school, and usually I was the guy that would get picked on, and I was not the kind of guy that would fight back, as Ernie mentioned earlier. The only fight I ever had, the teachers had to pull that girl off of me, and I didn't get into many other fights after that. I was not very tough. That's a true story. He wasn't lying. I wanted those guys to respect me bad. I wanted to be able to command respect's a better word. I wanted to actually keep them from picking on me. Because I got so tired of that. When I was in gym class or something like that, when they would be sitting behind me in class, they'd flick my ears and things like that. And what could I do? I was a little bitty guy, and I didn't want to turn around and start a ruckus or anything like that because they always won. I remember one guy, he had a cast, and I hated this guy for such a long time because he just always picked on me. He broke his arm, all right? He's basically crippled because he has only one arm. And even then, he came up and busted me over the head with his cast. I mean, it's like, Ty, you can't win for losing. This is not Ty being victimized. This is Ty just not doing anything about it. Anyway, I hated that. But I finally got back to Houston. I was sitting there having those drinks, and for some reason or another, I decided I would leave that bar and go over to this other nightclub that I normally would frequent. And I walked in, and I wasn't there probably 5 minutes before I looked across the room, and there was a guy that had put the contract out on me. And I said, oh, God. I had 2 options at that point. 1, I could walk out and find another place to hide. Or 2, I could go up and confront him. And I was tired of hiding, as I said earlier. So I decided to go confront him. I walked up to him and I said, look, here I am. If you want me, you can have me. And he turned to me and said, I don't want you, necessarily. I just want this from you. You're making a mess of your life. You're making a mess of my business. I want you out of the way, whichever way that takes. Now, I will arrange to come and have you picked up and taken home. Otherwise, I'm not going to lift the contract. And I thought about that option for a second. And I said, well, wait a minute. That's not really a good deal because, number 1, I still got all these drugs to deal and all this money to make. See? And I still haven't found Michelle Pfeiffer. And I still haven't got a Mercedes. And I ain't got the big house and haven't got all the money or anything like that. I still have these things to work for that I got to live for out there. And he asked me the question. He says, well, what do you got to show for it right now? And I thought about that for a second. All I had as far as clothes were in a paper bag behind the building. I had no place to stay that evening. The shoes I had on my feet were like a size 9.5, and I wear an 8. They were flopping like clown's feet. And no money. I pulled out the things in my pocket, and all I had was a few pennies. That was it. I really didn't have much to live for out there. I had nothing to show for what I'd been doing. And so I agreed to the terms, and he said, fine, I'll come and get you tomorrow. And he picked me up the next day, and on the way home, he says, look, you know, you're probably got to go to AA meetings or something like that because your mom said that that would be one of the rules, going to AA meetings. And I said, well, whatever, you know, we'll talk about that with her when we get there. And I eventually got home, and sure enough, she had these new rules as she sat down. My mom, by the way, is an Alcoholics Anonymous, as is my stepfather. So yeah, they know how, and she went to Al-Anon too. And so she knew exactly what to do with me when I got home. She says, these are the rules, these are what you're going to live by, that's it. You know, there's no exceptions. You'll look for a job, you'll go to AA meetings, there's no coming in drunk or anything like that. You just have to live by those. And I was like, oh, great. You know what, I thought about the options. You know, I still remember very vividly those guys chasing me down. As a matter of fact, that kept me sober for a long time, I think, or it obviously helped. Because every time when I would go somewhere, I'd always be looking behind my back. I was very paranoid for a long time in Alcoholics Anonymous. I'd always be looking behind my back to see if those guys were after me. I think probably too paranoid, because, I mean, think a $20 contract, they may not want to spend the gas to get to Houston, right? I'm going to take this off. Russell just said I had to wear it up here, but I could take it off afterwards to let you know that I could. Yeah, I would go to Alcoholics Anonymous early on. I went that first night with my mom and stepfather, some little group in a church back, small group. And after the meeting, my mom says, well, why didn't you get a desire chip? I said, well, what's that? I mean, they'd handed them out, but I didn't realize that you're supposed to get them if you want to stay sober. I was just really out of it. And she says, well, that means you want to stay sober. You have a desire to stop drinking, and that symbolizes that. She says, so if you want to stop drinking, go ahead and get one. I said, well, no problem. I can do that. I really didn't think it'd be a problem to stop drinking because I never tried to that point. And it was never a question of a will or anything like that. I really didn't think that I had a problem with it. And so I picked up the desire chip with all intentions of stopping drinking. And within about 2 weeks, I was drunk. And I didn't understand why I was drunk. I've been going to Alcoholics Anonymous. I've been listening to the meetings. I've been talking to a few people for what that's worth. And for some reason or another, one night after the meeting, my old friend, who did come to Alcoholics Anonymous with me for a while, said, why don't we go out afterwards and have a few drinks? And I said, well, that's fine, all right? Or, as a matter of fact, I said, you can have a few drinks. I'll just go along for the ride, because he wanted to go out to a nightclub. And I was still into the environment. I love the environment that you found alcohol in. Even though I didn't want to drink, I love the environment. And so I was going along for the ride. He said, well, I'm going to go and get a few wine coolers. If you want some, let me know. And I said, no, I don't want any. So he went in and got the wine coolers, came back out in the car. He says, you sure you don't want some? I said, no. Bent down, picked one up, and drank it. And didn't understand that. I just told myself no, and I had no idea why I was bending down and picking it up and drinking. That never happened before. It brought to mind something I've been hearing in Alcoholics Anonymous. They mentioned something about the disease being twofold, or actually three, but there's two parts. There's a mental obsession and a physical compulsion. And I didn't understand that really. Today I understand it a little better. And I think what was happening in that first few weeks or first month or two that I was in AA was I was having to answer those two questions for myself because I'd never answered them before. This is something my sponsor pointed out to me. If you drink for 30 years or so, chances are you're going to answer, or at least arrive at a lot of questions concerning your drinking. You might get to the point where you're asking yourself, why can't I quit? Well, if you only drink for maybe 4 years, you might never get to the point of asking yourself why you can't quit, which I never did. I never asked myself that. The only reason I was in AA at that point was because some guy said, look, if you don't go home, then I'm going to kill you. That was basically the only reason I was there. I was not there because I was asking myself the questions. All right? And so I had to go out and do a little more drinking to arrive at least the one pertinent question, and that is, can you drink or not? And so that night, I found out something. I said, well, wait a minute. My mind said no, but my gut said yes. All right? And there was a contradiction there. And well, there's another part that the physical compulsion, I had to answer that part too. Needless to say, I kept drinking. Not always because I wanted to. I kept drinking, and another night after a meeting, he said, well, let's go out and have a few drinks. And I said, fine. We went out, and we went to a nightclub, and I had a few wine coolers, about 3 or 4. And because I was only 20, I couldn't get one of those little wristbands that says you're allowed to drink once you go in. So all I had to go in with was the few beers, a few wine coolers that were in me. Well, I got in there, and my friend, who was a little older than I was, ordered 7 kamikazes, and I thought he'd gotten some for me. I thought he was going to share, and the selfish son of a gun drank them all himself. But what I learned from this was after he got those, there was a very big yearning that started occurring down in here. All right? I'd see that alcohol, and I knew down deep in here I needed some of that. And that was part 2. All right? I knew down in here that if I had a few drinks, I was going to feel even better than what I'd felt just with these 4. See? And I needed to answer that question as well. So I had 2 pieces of the puzzle that was necessary. All right? There was one left, and that was going to happen on April 27th of 1988. I'd been going to meetings, as I said, for probably a month or 2, and I had not been telling anybody that I'd been drinking. Instead, I've been going to meetings and I've been saying, oh, this is great, spirituality is great, God's great, life's great, everything's great. You know the guy whistling in the dark, right? Things are great. And the only thing is when I would go to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, I couldn't look people in the eye. I had a very hard time looking at you because I knew that every time I did, you're going to see right through me. Alcoholics have a way of doing that, especially if they've been there, they can look at you. Every time I'd see my sponsor, one of the things he would say is, you got something to tell me yet? Oh, what are you talking about? He knew a long time ago. When I finally told him, he says, I knew that. And I hate it because he does that. A lot of times I'll tell him something and he says, I knew that. And I thought it was just some old-timer thing. And in a way, that little experience, it kind of helps. But I'd go to AA and I'd lie to you, and this guilt was just really building up inside of me. And on April 27th of 1988, I was wanting to explode in 100 different directions. At that point, there was 2 things I wanted to do. I wanted to go down and get some beer, real bad, a whole bunch of beer, and just drink and drink and drink. That's what I wanted to do because I was hurting down here. The other thing I wanted to do was stay put, hold on, and don't do anything. Because I knew if I went back there and drank, what scared me to death, if I went back there and drank, I was going to be right back in the lifestyle and I was going to find myself with those guys right behind me. And I was terrified. See, I didn't want to live like that anymore. I didn't want to live with the torture down in here. I didn't want to live with being a bum or anything like that. I was tired of those things. I didn't want that life anymore. And my stepdad and my mom were sitting there and said, well, do we need to call your sponsor or something like that? I said, no, I don't want to talk to that old man. They said, well, can we do anything to help? And I said, no. My stepfather insisted that he read Bill's story to me. And I didn't want to hear Bill's story. I didn't want to hear anything of the big book. I didn't want to. But he said, sit down, go ahead, and I'll read this to you. And so here we go, Bill's story. And I didn't hear anything, I don't think. See, what he did was he kept me detained long enough for the pain to swell to the point that I said this simple little prayer. I bowed my head, closed my eyes, and I said, God, anything you want. Anything you want from me, I'm willing to do. But I don't want to feel like this, and I don't want to be like this anymore. See, I'm tired of the person I am living like this. I don't want to be this guy anymore. And when I lifted my head from that prayer, the pain was gone. The suffering that was down inside was gone. And there was a single thought left in my mind that kept repeating, and that was, it's going to be okay. See? And I knew it was going to be okay. Now, the key word in that particular sentence is going to be, not is. It's going to be okay, which means that there's going to be a lot of work left. Like I said, I did have a sponsor. It wasn't necessarily a sponsor of my choice. I'm much like Ray in the fact that I walked into an Alcoholics Anonymous and a guy came up to me and pointed to himself my sponsor. There's a little difference between my story and Ray's story in the sense that this guy came up and pointed himself my temporary sponsor. And he says, I'm going to be your temporary sponsor. And this guy I'd already talked to before. He was grouchy, he was mean. When he come up to me, the first thing he ever said to me was, shut up and give me a cup of coffee. All right? And so he was just a real grump. And the day he said, I'm your temporary sponsor, he said, until you find somebody to be your permanent sponsor. Well, when he left, I went and grabbed somebody and said, please be my sponsor, you know. But this guy, he knew better than that. He had come into Alcoholics Anonymous at a very young age himself. And I think he knew very well the games that an alcoholic plays, especially a young alcoholic. And so he didn't let up. Instead, what he would do is on a regular basis, he would call me and say, come on over to my house. We're going to work. Oh, joy. All right. And we'd get over there, and he says, we're going to tear apart my car today. I said, great. And we'd tear apart his engine, and I really didn't know anything about cars, so I was a tool, man. He said, hand me that wrench, or hand me those pliers, or hand me this, pick up this. You know, I was the back man. And I did this for like a month or so. And he said, well, today we're going to go paint a house. And I go out there, and we paint, and this and that. And that's all this guy really did, ever, was he worked me. All right? Of course, we'd take breaks because we'd go to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. All right? Or we'd go see his sponsor. And the whole time, one of the funny things was he never really mentioned any of the steps to me. What he did do was he gave me a list of 7 things to do, including reading the big book and a morning meditation book and making a meeting regularly and calling the sponsor regularly and saying prayers morning and evening. He gave me a list of 7 things to do. But he didn't mention steps. All right? And I think maybe it's a good thing that he didn't mention steps, because I don't know that I was ready for any steps. I believe the steps say something to the effect of, if you want what we have, and as my sponsor always says, I'm not sure that I knew what you had, all right? But instead, the one thing I could do is I could try to follow some of those little things on that list. And I really wasn't good at very many of them because I just wouldn't do them. But the ones I could do was I said my prayer morning and night, and I would talk to him and I would make a meeting. And those things helped me tremendously. But anyway, this guy would just simply work me to death. And instead of talking about steps or any of those things on the list, what he would talk to me about is, we'd be working and he'd bang his thumb with a hammer and he'd say, shit, like that. And he'd say, well, I don't got to drink over it. I said, And he'd be going along and he'd get his hand with a wrench and say, damn it. He said, well, I don't got to drink over it. And I think he was impressing upon me the fact that just because things don't happen the way I want them to, I don't got to drink over it. Just a little thing, because stumping my toe was a perfectly good excuse for drinking in the past. And little things like that. Another thing he did by always having me around him, and my sponsor was this way, I didn't hardly ever leave his site the first year. We just always did everything together, was he says, you don't need to go to that meeting over there. And I didn't know why until I started putting two and two together. The meeting that I'd first come to that he took me away from had all these pretty girls at it. And the one he took me to had all these old people at it. I hated that. I didn't like the fact that, I would go to, the only thing good about A in the beginning was I could go over there and be pretty girls there. And he just destroyed it for me. So I had to go to this meeting when there was nothing but people that wanted to stay sober. But guess what I heard, though? I think, a lot of good sobriety that first year because of what he did. Another thing about the fact that he always had me around working. I got to tell this story. I love to tell this story. If you ever seen the movie called The Karate Kid, you'll remember that there's a guy in there, a boy. Yeah, she's got the story down already. There's a boy in there named Daniel-san, and there's an old man in there named Mr. Miyagi. And as a matter of fact, my sponsor looks a lot like Mr. Miyagi, but he's meaner. And Daniel-san is basically a roughed-up old boy who's having problems with these guys at school. And Mr. Miyagi finds him one day and says, come on in here, I'll help you. I'll help you take care of yourself. I'll show you to get out there and take care of those guys. But not only that, I'll show you how to apply some things out in the real world outside of fighting. See? He said, just do what I say. And so he's over at my house 7 o'clock in the morning. And he gets out there and he says, okay, karate lessons. Take this bucket, this water, and everything else and go out here and wash these cars and then wax them. And Daniel-san goes, all right. But there's a very meticulous way in which he's supposed to do it, all right? I don't think Daniel-san caught that. Neither did I early on with my sponsor. And so Daniel-san washes the cars and it gets done, and the next day he says, well, maybe do karate lessons tomorrow. And he gets back up there the next morning, and Mr. Miyagi says, well, today we're going to sand the floor and do it like this. And he gets out there and he sands the floor, and of course Daniel-san's going, man, I'll be glad when we get to the karate lessons. Next day he gets back out there and Mr. Miyagi says, well, let's paint the fence. And there's a way he's supposed to do it. And he paints that fence, and after a while he gets tired of all this. He says, this guy's doing nothing but he's using me for slave labor, all right? I'm just working and breaking my back and for nothing. I'm not getting paid. I'm not learning anything or nothing. And so he decides he's going to storm off the job one day and says, to hell with this. And before he leaves, Mr. Miyagi catches him and says, well, wait a minute now, why are you leaving? And Daniel says, well, you agreed to teach me karate. He says, well, I know. He says, well, I haven't learned anything, but I've been working. He says, well, hold on a second. He said, do something for me real quick. He says, I want you to wax on. And Daniel-san goes, what? And he says, wax on. And so he makes a motion of waxing on while Mr. Miyagi throws a punch, and he finds out that he blocks the punch. He says, I want you to do something else for me. I want you to paint the fence. And Daniel-san makes the motion of painting the fence. Mr. Miyagi throws a punch, and he finds out that he can block the punch by making that motion. And the parallel here is that when I was over there every day with my sponsor working, all right, I thought that all he was doing was using me for slave labor. What he was teaching me were things I never did know how to do. I'd always walk off jobs because they were too tough. He said, stay. Say, I never did want to get out there and put forth any effort. He said, work. I never wanted to show up on time. He said, be there at 7 o'clock. See, and I had no idea I was learning any lessons at all. I was taking it all for granted. That stuff was really going to be showing for me, though, a few years later, because I did find a willingness to work the steps somewhere, all right? I did kind of begin to become interested in Alcoholics Anonymous, and maybe it was because of these first few months or whatever that I spent with my sponsor. I think that had a big part to do with it. But I became very interested in what these people were talking about. As a matter of fact, I know the day. I know the day that I became interested, and it was 3 months after I was sober, and it was in August, and my sponsor was giving a talk. And I didn't know my sponsor very well outside of what he told me to do. But that evening, when he gave his talk, that was probably one of the best talks I ever heard, but one of the things that he said at the very end was this. He said, all I want to do is go home at night put on the shades, turn out the lights, and be at peace with myself. And I said, you know, I've been looking for that thing for, I don't know how long I've been looking for that thing. But that's all I ever looked for. See? It was just some ability to go home with nobody else there and be okay with me, and I never had it. And I said, you know, there's something, if that's what this program has to offer, that's what I want. And I took a little interest. Every time people would start talking about steps, my ears would perk up. See, I kind of wanted to hear what they were saying, what they were doing, what was helping them find what that old man had had. As a matter of fact, that's the first night, by the way, that I ever saw him smile. He was always, when I would talk to him, he was grumpy and grouchy and cantankerous. He never had nothing nice to say. And that night, he had this big old smile on his face, and I knew what he meant when he said peace. See, and that's what I wanted. And so I started working the steps, I think. Actually, I got my old sponsor, and he started helping me work the steps. And that little 7-step list I'd had, I didn't know it, but he says, these things are helping you do the first 3 steps. See? Because he looked at it this way. He says, if you've done a step, there's going to be some indication that you've done a step. Any action has a reaction. Anytime you do something, there's evidence that you've done that. What's the evidence of somebody that wants to stay sober? If you've made the decision to stay sober, there should be some kind of evidence. And in my case, the evidence was that I was making meetings. I looked like somebody wanting to stay sober, at least, because I was making the meetings and I was reading the books and I was trying to be at the sponsor's house on time. I was doing things that would be indicative of a person trying to stay sober. And so in that way, I think I was working step 1. I would think I was working step 2 by doing that little list, because I was looking for an answer somewhere else besides up here in my own head. See? He said, if you have a question, come ask me, or I'll lead you to somebody that can answer your question, or look in your big book. But for all, you know, just don't think. All right? Don't think about what the answer is. Come ask me, or we'll get somebody that can talk to you about it. And so I was looking for an answer from somebody else besides me. And that was new, because I was always looking for my own answers. See? I was the one that was wanting to be the one in charge, and I was the one wanting to make the decisions. And from there, I was letting him help me make decisions, and other people help me make the right decision. And I did the 3rd step formally and saying the 3rd step prayer, and we jumped right into the 4th step after that, about a year sober. And some of those things, something that really gave me problems on my 4th step was my first 3 years living with my father. That was the one thing that I was going to leave off. You know, there's one for everybody, maybe 2 or 3, or maybe a lot more, that we like to leave off of our 4th step. I put down all the things in my 4th step that I liked people to know about, things that I would have talked to anybody about. You know, I didn't mind people thinking of me as a thief or a robber, because where I came from, the environment, that was cool. So I'd put down the fact that I was a thief and a liar and a cheat. I didn't mind being a bum, all right? I just didn't like people knowing that something could hurt me, see? I didn't want people to know that. I didn't want people to know that I was that vulnerable. And so I didn't want to share with my sponsor this thing right here about my father, the fact that that experience hurt me. Because I thought that he didn't love me, and that's why he beat me. You know, I didn't want to share that with anybody, because that was sharing the important stuff, the things that make you vulnerable, and I didn't want to share that. And I had to choke that out. And he said, well, okay, you've done that. You put that on your 4th, 5th step. He said, well, now let's look at your part. Well, you're wrong. And I was very mad at him because he asked me that question. Because he asked me where I was wrong in something that I felt I had no control over. And since I didn't know, he says, well, let me answer that question for you. He says, at some point in your life, you took what your father did, and you made the decision to believe whether it was true or false. You made the decision to feed off that, see? You could have said, look, I'm going to believe that what he did was right. I'm going to believe that what he said about me was true. Or you could have decided and said, no, that's not true. I'm not that kind of person, and I wasn't worthy of that. That's just the way life is. I made that decision. And I had to look at that for me, because I couldn't go around all my whole life thinking I was just victimized. Sure, he had an awful big part, all right? But at some point, I have to say, look, I'm responsible for the things that happen from here on out, see? And nobody else can pay this bill but me. And when I got rid of that piece of garbage, man, I felt so good, and I felt relieved, and I felt clean. See? And up to that point, when I'd go to meetings, I would feel so isolated. I walk in, and I felt like I just didn't fit in, like all you people were over there, and I didn't fit in. But when that garbage was gone, it seemed like, man, I could fit in. When I was about a year sober, I talked to my sponsor about wanting to go to school. And I'd wanted to go and get like a little trade or something like that so I could make a little money. I've been out working this labor job for a long time, and my back was killing me. And I said, I need to get a job where I can, you know, a little plusher than this. I don't want to work in the labor. I'm a wimp. All right, I'm a terrible wimp. I would just soon sit in a desk somewhere, kick my feet up, and take naps at noontime. But we thought about going to school. That's what I talked about with my sponsor. He said, well, why don't you take yourself a few courses and see how you can do? I said, all right. I went up there and I applied to school and I took their little entry exam, and I did terrible, but it shouldn't surprise me. I'd been out of school for a while, and everything I'd learned I'd lost, and I didn't learn that much. I did terrible when I was in high school and elementary. As a matter of fact, I failed my senior year, but the only reason my teacher gave me a D to get me out was so she wouldn't have me the next year. But I did terrible in school. And one of the things about it is I always had this real problem when I'd go to school, because I would look at all these guys and gals up there, and I called them nerds. All right? You know, they would have the glasses, and they always have a nose in the book, and so it was a bunch of nerds, see? And what it really was, I know today, was I was just very angry with them because they were doing so well. But anyway, I thought that for some reason they had some genetic disposition that allowed them to be intelligent. And I didn't think I had that, and the proof was in the pudding. The fact was they made A's and I made D's. And so that was proof, all right? Well, I've been going to AA long enough by this point that I started putting some things together. I said, well, maybe there's some other key factors. You never can just take things at face value. And so I said, well, maybe I can do okay in school. I went in there and had to start on remedial courses, remedial math and remedial writing and things of that nature. And my first semester, I got, you don't really get A's in remedial courses, you just get to get out of them. You get to excel just to one grade higher. And so I had to do this for one semester before I could get into college level courses like English Comp and college algebra. And I said, well, this will be a real test. You know, I got all the remedial stuff, okay, well, that's great. You know, it's an accomplishment. And so I go take my college algebra and my English, and I make A's and B's. And I said, well, it was obviously a mistake, because just those things don't happen. My track record says that when I'm in school, I make C's and I make D's. You just don't make A's. And I said, well, look, my weaknesses will show as I go higher. I'm just very supportive of myself. And so I got into the next level, and I took, you know, sophomore English, and I took trigonometry, and I went in there and I made A's. A big mistake. The teachers are miscalculating or something. And I kept on going on like this, and eventually I got into this course. I took college calculus, and I said, well, this is certain. It's going to show here. I mean, if I take a calculus course, whew, that's what all those real intelligent kids used to take. And look at me, you know, I made C's and D's. I can't do that, and I made an A. And it started to dawn on me, you know how I got that A, by the way? All those days I spent out there working with my sponsor, you know. Well, what I did when I went to school was, my sponsor told me to do this. He said, go out there and be willing to sacrifice your social hours. All right, you may not get all the coffee sessions after a meeting. You may not get to make 7, 8, 9 meetings a week. All right, be willing to give some of those things up and study. And I said, well, all right, I can do that. And what I began to piece together after doing this for a few semesters was maybe that what contributed to those good grades was work. And it never dawned on me that what contributed to those things was work. And I thought back to those guys I used to call nerds when I was in elementary school, and I said to myself, I wonder what they were doing when they went home. It never dawned on me. I mean, when I went home, I would go play football until the sun went down, and I'd go inside and watch TV. It never dawned on me that those guys would go inside and they'd work for what they wanted. They didn't ask the world to give it to them. They said, look, I want this, I'll work for it. And that was a new concept to me. And so that's exactly what I did when I went to school. Is I'll go in there and I'll be willing to make the sacrifices and I'll work for it. I've been doing that now for 6 years, and it gets old. I'm on a 10 or 11 year plan. You know, it's a long hike. Because, and this was one of the things, is if you want something, you got to work for it. But not only that, you got to be willing to make sacrifices. I don't get to make as many meetings as I would like to make. I was a meeting junkie and a convention junkie in my first year, and to cut all those things out was very difficult for me in the first few years in AA. And the reason was because I felt like I wasn't making a contribution to Alcoholics Anonymous if I was away at school. See, I felt like for some reason Alcoholics Anonymous needed my presence in the meetings, like I was that important. Well, it is important for me to be there. I need to make meetings, all right? But my thing is I had to learn that there's other ways to make contributions to Alcoholics Anonymous. See, I had to have a lot of talks with my sponsor about this, about applying AA principles outside of AA. See, and that's what school has really been about for me. Outside of learning the math and the physics and things like that, the last 6 years have been just as much about trying to learn how you apply AA out there. See, when you can't hang out 5 days a week with your sponsor, when you can't have a drunk over at your house every night because you're staying up till midnight studying. See, when you're under those circumstances, can you still act and behave and do the best you can? I mean, can you still have some sort of peace of mind? Can you still be kind and giving? Can you still be tolerant? Can you still have those principles that you work for in the steps without always being surrounded by AA? And that's been a very difficult lesson because I find it's very hard to do it without all those influences. To try to carry them around with me, that's sometimes very difficult to do. One of the things I found out I have to do is take the 12-step and apply it to people that aren't alcoholics. I don't get to do sponsorship a lot or 12-step calls a lot, and from what I've been taught in AA, that's Alcoholics Anonymous, one drunk talking to another drunk, see? And when I don't get to get out and help alcoholics, I thought that for some reason I wasn't doing 12-step work, see? And the 12-step is helping others, not other alcoholics necessarily, but helping others. And I had to find out, how can I help people out there at school or at home, on the job, wherever. One of the things I've been able to work on lately is I have a friend of mine who I've been taking math courses with for the last 3 semesters. And this is my little project. I was going to try to apply AA outside of AA. This guy, we'd have study sessions, and he was always saying to me when we get together and study, he says, well, how do you work this problem? All right? And it began to just wear on me because every time I turn around, it's like, how do you work this problem? How do you work this problem? And he would never work the problem himself. And the thing was, he's a very intelligent guy. All right? And the first thing I wanted to do was become very intolerant and say, you know, stop this. You know, you're just annoying me. And I had to think about that. That's not what my sponsor did to me when I'd always go to him, because I was always going to him. He said, well, how do you work this problem? How do you work this problem? How do you do this problem? See, I put my sponsor through hell the first year, because every time I had a decision to make, I was like, how do you do this and how do you do that? And I said, well, wait a minute now, what would my sponsor do with me? I said, oh, yeah, that's right. And the next time that guy asked me a question, how do you work this math problem? I said, you're smart enough to figure it out. See, I didn't condemn or anything else. I said exactly what my sponsor did to me when I was 2 years sober. For 2 years, every time I had a problem, he would say, here's how you work through it. When I got to be about 2 years sober, I went up to him, I said, how do you work this problem? He says, I think you've been sober long enough to figure that one out. See, and he gave me a little leeway. He was giving me a little room and said, go out there now and see if you can stand up on your own. So you've leaned here a long time, you need to get out there and stand up and walk a little. And that's what I try to do with this guy. And it's a real challenge because I don't, you know, the patience and everything else, and I'm working at it. Anyway, this school thing has been very important to me, and it's something it's been fun, and I'll be glad when I get to the end, though. 10 years or 6 years has been a long time, and I always complain to my sponsor about, I want the good life. I want all the benefits that come from going to school, but I want them now. And I don't want to put in 3 more years of work. I want them now because I haven't been going on dates for 6 years. I haven't been going out to eat for 6 years. Well, I go out to eat, but not a lot of going out and doing things for about 6 years. And I want those things now. And one of the things that always comes to mind when I start getting in that frame of mind, when I start saying, you know, I just need to quit this stuff because I'm ready to get out of here. I don't want any more work. There's something I always think of, and it was my first year. I had a job at this place called Norbertumi, processing plastics. We had 500-pound barrels of plastic, and we put them on a guillotine and cut slabs and stack them all day long. And this was my second job, and it was the hardest job I've ever had, and it was with my sponsor. I got to work with him 40 hours a week. But I would stack these slabs, and after a week of this, I came in one day, and my sponsor looked at me, and he could tell. He could tell I was ready to quit. He could tell that I was ready to walk out the door and say, that's it, that's enough, no more. And all he said to me was, he said, don't let the job beat you. And that was it. And that's been a lot to me down the years, because every time I get in some little situation in school where I say, look, I'm tired of making the sacrifices, I don't think I can put up with it anymore, I'm tired of staying up late, I'm tired of working, I'm tired of all this, the thought that crosses my mind is don't let the job beat you. And it's going to pay off if I can hang in there. My life has been very blessed. My parents have been very supportive in a lot of ways that other people's parents are not. I see a lot of young people who come in and their parents really don't understand that they're alcoholic. You know, they really don't understand that their child needs to go to AA or anything like that, and my parents, because of the circumstances, are not like that. And my life in every way is just better. And I owe that to Alcoholics Anonymous. Alcoholics Anonymous took a little kid who'd spent a lot of years out there on the streets trying to live in this big boy's world. And today I think that y'all have made me a man, maybe just trying to live in God's world. Thank you very much.